Hello and welcome to my channel. Today's lecture is about the diencephalon, so let's begin. Generally we call the diencephalon is the thalamus, but actually, to be precise, the thalamus is part of the diencephalon because the diencephalon has parts other than the thalamus. It's composed of right and left halves. This is the diencephalon, as you can see here. All this is the diencephalon. Right and left halves separated by the hypothalamic sulcus, which is evident here, into dorsal and ventral parts. The dorsal diencephalon is the thalamus. This is the thalamus proper. The metathalamus are the medial and lateral geniculate bodies, and the epithalamus, which is the pineal gland and habenular trigone. The ventral diencephalon anteriorly is the hypothalamus and posteriorly is the subthalamus, right above the midbrain. So it has a dorsal part, a ventral part. The thalamus proper anteriorly is bounded by the interventricular foramen of Monro. This is the foramen of Monro. It makes the lateral walls of the third ventricle, and laterally is the remember the horizontal section we studied with the internal capsule. The posterior limb of the internal capsule is lateral boundary or lateral relation to the thalamus. Dorsally is the body of the lateral ventricle. Of course, the lateral ventricle is hidden here. Caudally is the midbrain, as you can see here, and the lateral surface is covered by the external medullary lamina. The internal medullary lamina is this lamina, this red one, are white fibers, myelinated fibers, and Y-shaped, divides the thalamus into anterior, medial, and lateral parts. Anterior, medial, and lateral parts. Thalamic nuclei structurally divided into anterior, medial, and lateral, and intralaminar inside the lamina itself. Functionally, they are divided into three classes: relay nuclei, intralaminar nuclei, and reticular nuclei. The relay nuclei further divided into specific and non-specific, and the reticular nucleus that surrounds the thalamus, especially the lateral part, it's a thin sheet that covers the lateral aspect of the thalamus. This is the reticular nucleus, and its main inhibitory function, or controls the output from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Now, this table shows you the types of thalamic nuclei. For example, specific nuclei, we have anterior nucleus between the two limbs of the Y, the afferents received from the mammillary bodies and the hippocampus, the efferents to the cingulate cortex. Ventroanterior and ventrolateral nuclei connected to the substantia nigra, pars reticulata of the substantia nigra. We study this with the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex. Ventrolateral anterior part is connected to the globus pallidus, which is part of the lentiform nucleus. Ventrolateral posterior part and ventral posterior are connected to the cerebellum. Remember this, cerebellar nuclei, and the premotor and motor cortex. The ventroposterolateral is the major relay for the sensations from the body below the head, from the trunk and the limbs, and it projects to the somatic sensory cortex, while those sensations coming from the head relay in the ventroposteromedial part, or ventroposteromedial nucleus, and project also to the corresponding regions on the somatic sensory cortex. The medial geniculate body, it's part of the auditory pathway and connected to the inferior colliculus, while the lateral geniculate body or the lateral geniculate nucleus is part of the visual pathway, receives the optic tract and projects to the primary visual cortex. Association nuclei, like the lateral dorsal nucleus connected to the hippocampus and cingulate cortex, these are limbic system. Dorsomedial or medial nucleus is a prefrontal, connected to the prefrontal cortex, olfactory and limbic systems. Lateral posterior or pulvinar, it's an association nucleus, connects to the visual, auditory, and somatosensory cortex, and connects also to the part of the cortex which has association function, posterior parietal and lateral temporal association cortex. Non-specific thalamic nuclei are the intralaminar. The major one is the centromedian nucleus. They connect to the reticular formation. That's why they call it non-specific. Basal ganglia and limbic system, and the reticular nucleus afferents from the thalamus and cortex, and efferents to the thalamus. It controls actually the functions of the thalamus, the reticular nucleus. So that was a hint about the thalamic nuclei. We have what's so-called the Thalamic Syndrome, in which there is a lesion in the thalamus, leads to damage to the posterior part of the ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedial, means the sensory nuclei that receive sensation from the body. So leads to loss of sensations of the contralateral side, because the fibers, they cross below the thalamus, of course. And there's severe exaggerated pain, and sensory ataxia due to damage of proprioception. I told you before, the proprioception are the information coming from the joints and surrounding muscles about the status of the joint and the status of body in space, for a major factor for the equilibrium. And emotional instability accompanies the thalamic syndrome. Now, the epithalamus, composed of the pineal gland and habenular nuclei. The pineal gland, in histology, you will find what's called the pinealocytes and deposits of calcium called the pineal sand, and some neuroglial cells, of course. It atrophies with age and responsible for the circadian rhythm. The changes in levels in different hormones in the body according to the light and dark cycle. Habenular nuclei, on the other hand, they lie under the habenular trigone. This is the habenular trigone here. This is the pineal gland. This is the habenular trigone. It receives triamidallar thalami that brings fibers from the amygdala and project through the fasciculus retroflexus to the interpeduncular nucleus between the peduncles of the midbrain. Also receives from the olfactory tubercle and the hypothalamus. They decussate to form the habenular commissure. This is the habenular commissure anterior to the pineal gland, and controls salivation and gastric and intestinal secretory and motor activity. When you smell or see the smell of food, for example, being cooked, you start to salivate to prepare yourself to eat. This is the function of the and you start to feel, if you're hungry, for example, you'll feel some contractions in your GIT. This is the function of the habenular nuclei. Posterior commissure, fibers from nucleus of Kegel. This is in the wall of the third ventricle. Sorry. Fibers of the medial longitudinal fasciculus, the MLF, and the periaqueductal gray in the midbrain. They decussate as the posterior commissure. The subthalamus, we'll study this later, but now it's a hint about the subthalamus. The nuclei are the upper end of the red nucleus, the upper end of the substantia nigra, the subthalamic nucleus, the zona incerta nuclei, the nucleus of prerubral field of Forel. This prerubral means the around the red nucleus of the midbrain, anterior to the or superior to the red nucleus of the midbrain, and nucleus of Ancillary Lenticularis. The Ancillary Lenticularis connects the lentiform nucleus and the thalamus, and it curves around the anterior edge of the internal capsule. That's why it's called ANSA. Tracts in the subthalamus, the upper parts of the medial lemniscus. This carries the major sensations from the body below the head. Spinal lemniscus. This carries the fibers of pain and temperature. Trigeminal lemniscus, that carries sensations from the head. Trigeminal lemniscus. Dentatothalamic fibers from the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. And the superior cerebellar peduncle decussates, so it receives from the contralateral dentatothalamic fibers. Receives ipsilateral rubrothalamic fibers from the red nucleus. Fasciculus lenticularis and ansa lenticularis. I told you before, this connects the lentiform nucleus with the thalamus. But the fasciculus lenticularis, instead of looping around the anterior edge of the internal capsule like the ansa lenticularis, it pierces the internal capsule, through the internal capsule. Fasciculus retroflexus is the major output of the habenular nuclei to the interpeduncular nucleus, and receives also tracts fasciculus from the prerubral field of Forel related to the upper margin of the red nucleus of the midbrain. The subthalamic nucleus connects mainly with the corpus striatum, which is the anterior end of the putamen and the caudate nucleus. We'll study this in the basal ganglia. It inhibits the globus pallidus, which is part of the lentiform nucleus. And lesion leads to hemibalismus and chorea. These are abnormal, sudden, violent movements of the contralateral sides. Proximal muscles, mainly proximal muscles, means the big muscles. Hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, this is the region of the hypothalamus here. It's bounded superiorly by the hypothalamic sulcus, the lamina terminalis, and the subthalamus posteriorly. In the floor of the third ventricle, the structures in the floor of the third ventricle are the optic chiasma, infundibulum, tuberocynerium, a piece of gray matter. Infundibulum is the top of the pituitary stalk, and the mammillary bodies, and posteriorly is the posterior perforated substance. These are the structures in the floor of the third ventricle. This is the pituitary gland here, and above the pituitary gland, it's connected to a posterior lobe to the hypothalamus through the infundibulum. This is the infundibulum. By pituitary stalk, this is the stalk here, that forms what runs inside the stalk is the axons of the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei terminating in the posterior lobe of the gland. The supraoptic and paraventricular are responsible for the formation of the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. They are formed in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary, as we studied before. The posterior perforated substance has the interpeduncular nucleus receiving fasciculus retroflexus. The mammillary bodies, the bodies you see here, are two pea-sized bodies covered by fibers from the fornix. They receive fibers from the fornix, the mammillary bodies, and have the medial and lateral mammillary nuclei. We will come to this later with the limbic system. Tuber cinereum is a convex mass of gray matter which is above the pituitary stalk in the floor of the third ventricle, or the floor of the hypothalamus actually. Nuclei of the hypothalamus, we have the supraoptic nucleus, which produces the antidiuretic hormone, or other name of the antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin, because it has a direct constricting action on the blood vessels. Paraventricular nucleus, which produces oxytocin. For remember, the oxytocin is responsible for the ejection of milk and uterine contractions in females. The mammillary nuclei, functions of the nuclei, they control the endocrine function in the body. The oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone, it prevents diuresis, means it preserves water in the body and has a direct constricting effect on blood vessels, so it raises the blood pressure. Oxytocin responsible for the production, the production of milk. The hormone responsible for it is prolactin, but be careful. It's for ejection of milk and uterine contractions. It has a parasympathetic effects all over the body and responsible for the biological clock. You see, the variety of functions of the hypothalamus are numerous. Controls the sexual behavior, controls feeding, for example. We have the lateral zone, lesion in the lateral zone leads to aphasia. Aphasia means inability to eat. And in the medial zone, it's the satiety center lesion, and it leads to hyperphagia, hyper-eating. Water regulation through the osmoreceptors, and emotions. See the variety of the functions of the hypothalamus. It's numerous, has numerous functions. The metathalamus contains the medial geniculate nucleus, or the medial geniculate body in the auditory pathway, and the lateral geniculate nucleus or the lateral geniculate body, which is part of the visual pathway. That was a hint about the diencephalon. I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.